Hey, good afternoon. My name is Tony Wayda with JBF Consulting, and I'm joined by my colleague, Brian Carlson from Cornerstone Edge. And today we're going to talk about the integration trap. We're going to have some practical discussions around TMS and WMS integrations with some broader information on how to help you better select software and avoid some of the common pitfalls that we've lived in real world experiences. My point of this whole podcast, if you take anything away, is before you spend $1 on TMS or WMS software, there's some pre-work that you should complete. And most companies skip part of this or all of it, and then they find out too late when they selected the wrong product and they're integrating something that's really not going to work for them.
Tony, good afternoon. Good to be with you today as well. And you're right. It's a lot of times companies do well in starting the process, but there's always some gaps that are missed. And in the end, it really doesn't matter when you look at the integration, whether it's the WMS that failed, the TMS that failed, some middleware that had a problem, but nobody cares. It just needs to be fixed. And ultimately, it's everybody's problem when it doesn't work right.
Yeah, I 100% agree, Brian. At the end of the day, people just want to know where their stuff's at or why they didn't get it. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to actually talk about some of the critical topics, and we're going to actually touch on some of our experience with some of the vendors and what we're seeing. Some of the big guys, Manhattan, Oracle, Blue Yonder, some of the guys that have both WMS, TMS, and talk about, what we see them doing out there in the real world from a product and roadmap standpoint as well. So a lot of different information, a lot of key takeaways here that hopefully you'll find valuable.
Absolutely. And ultimately, when we look at it, it all ties down to the business requirements. Within those business requirements, you might have operational needs, but there's also technical needs. And as we know, the TMS world has been cloud-based in quite some time. The WMS world has caught up, and that's a big piece of it. However, there's a lot of other business functions that tie to this. And if you don't have it clearly outlined on how you do load planning, how you do the details for scheduling appointments, how you receive and product handle ASNs, all the details that go along with that, it shouldn't just be a high-level bullet point list, but very, very discrete, specific requirements that you can match with each individual vendor, because every vendor can do the high-level requirements, but they can't always dive into the exact details needed.
Yeah. As we always say, make sure you have your unique requirements, get your strategy and your requirements first before you even think about the software. And, speaking of, detailed requirements, I have a real world example from some years ago where we're implementing on an inbound model. And it was basically for the vendor portal. So everybody knows that inbound is one of the toughest areas because of the level of change management to implement a TMS. And obviously there's tie-in for the WMS because you've got to get your information from the TMS and be able to have the vendor select what they're going to ship off their PO, right? And this, where I'm leading is detailed requirements, right? Everybody can pull up a portal and say, oh yeah, here's the PO and here's how the vendor would go in and select the items they're shipping, make the routing requests, send it to the optimization, build your truckload or multi-stop truckload or whatever that is. But in this case, when we actually got to testing, the client had very large POs. And the vendor portal would not even pull up the PO because the PO was so large with so many line items. So again, when you start getting into your detailed requirements, it's very important that you get down to that level of detail. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but we also like to see scripted demos with your data, which vendors don't necessarily like. But if you're making a big investment and you're really looking for a long-term partner from a software vendor, allow them the time in the RFP process, but make them build demos that you've scripted with your data.
Absolutely. And even if you do all of that right, it's very important and I'll just give another story from a warehousing standpoint. We've gone through all the scripts for doing inbound ASNs, walk through the process, have pallet level ASNs, have case level ASNs, all the details that go into that, and all that work great. The TMS does the same thing. It provides us all that information. It provides pallet and case level ASNs, and you've got the data coming in through your EDIs, and we've got all that mapped out. And then what you tend to forget as well is, there's other people involved. There's vendors that are involved, and the vendors are willing to do one of the portals, but they may not want to do both of the portals. And we've seen that experience with an apparel company. You can do all the right requirements. You can get everything lined up as it relates to the right business requirements in the WMS, the TMS. You've even integrated with the appropriate EDI solutions, and everything's mapped out properly. You've got the ASNs figured out. You've tested everything in scripted demos. And then what you find out later is, oh, there's a gap in actually aligning with the vendors. So they may have some requirements where they're willing to put data into one system, but not two systems. And if you don't have everything fully integrated, or they're not fully integrated, you're going to have some gaps. And so aligning not just from the technology standpoint, but from all upstream and downstream resources is really critical as you look at this as well.
Yeah, change management is always a big part of that. Thinking back to kind of the first example I was giving about the PO, there's the tie into, the WMS there, because obviously until my vendor tells me, hey, here's what I'm shipping, and I basically build that information and send that to the DC doesn't know what to load on the truck, right? We're going to get into some other examples that kind of reverse that when you get into retail and some of the flow loading. But another area where we need to think about the integration between TMS and WMS is when you get into tracking your shipments, especially inbound shipments, right? Because typically you've got your appointment scheduling with the carrier, you've got your dock door scheduling in the DC. Those obviously need to tie together. If a truck is late, I'm trying to plan my labor. I can actually pull, a drop trailer they got in the yard and unload that, rather than having the team sit around waiting, not knowing that the truck's going to be late. And then all of a sudden 15 minutes in past the time I found out, oh, hey, the guy's, running an hour late. Those are some like real world examples, and it seems pretty simple, but you would be surprised at how many people don't have that visibility. And that visibility goes, all the way back through, how am I connected to my carrier? How am I communicating with my carrier? And is that through some type of RTTV, or is it just, simple EDI? So another, important factor there is making sure that you have that integration and notifications in the DC, and they have visibility to those inbound shipments. And it's probably the same for outbound, right? If I've got an outbound truck that's a live load and he's running late, what can I do to basically still utilize my labor and not lose that cost there?
Mm-hmm. And as it relates to labor, that is something that's critical for the entire warehouse operation, and understanding what that could look like, what updates you have for scheduling so you can assign resources to the right area. The other thing, again, ties to not just technology, but the processes that you have in place is if carriers are going to be late, what type of scheduling or rescheduling do you want to occur, and provide them with updates so that you can do labor planning and not just completely rely on the transportation schedule that's provided to you or any updates that happen. You need to be able to do a two-way update as well to make sure that they can plan accordingly too.
Yeah, and I think that's the piece is there's a lot of two-way communication between WMS, TMS, and then you can even get into yard, and depending on where your scheduling system lands. But some years ago, working with Manhattan, doing an implementation, and it was for a large retail client. And the retail client did what we kind of call flow loading, which is common. A lot of times they're pushing out things for promotions, and they're basically just loading up those trucks to go to their delivery agents, which typically are break bulk, where basically they send a truckload in and they break it out and they send it to all the various stores, whether it's in the malls or standalone. But with that, they don't know what's in actually all going to make it onto the truck, because they're just loading it until it's full. So this is where we ran into, a bit of a challenge on the TMS WMS integration, because we needed to create a load in the TMS so that we can tender it out early enough so that we can get a carrier assigned to it. But then we didn't know what was actually going to be in that truck until the load closed. So there had to be this two-way communication back and forth. And this was when this client was running Manhattan PKMS in the DC, and we were implementing older version Manhattan TP&E, because this was 2015 or 2016, sometime around that. But this again is where, you have to understand that tight integration, because we have to know when that truck started loading. We need to know when that door's closed. And at that point in time, we need to basically update the details of the shipment in the TMS. And none of that integration was established, right? And it was critical, and we had to build some new integrations. We had to, have some modifications. But this is where a lot of your software providers that have a TMS and a WMS will say they're integrated. And in some cases, that's true. But at what level? And this is a point where you kind of need to dig into the details of what is it that you're exactly passing back and forth, because we had another example in a similar situation where we were told that the platforms were integrated. This client actually selected the TMS with the WMS because they were told it was integrated, when actually the transportation logistics partner had selected a different TMS, but it ended up being a platform sale because they were told it was integrated. Well, when we got into it and got underneath the hood, it wasn't fully integrated. They were sending some information back and forth, but not enough to meet the customer's requirements. So we ended up having to do more integration. So point is, again, detailed requirements, understand what you're trying to do there and what information the vendor really is passing back and forth between their systems.
It's funny how common that is, Tony, because I have a very similar story where we worked with an appliance organization, and they were looking at a WMS and TMS. We did all the requirements. We got all that outlined. In the end, they chose the WMS vendor, and they were down to a finalist for 2 TMS vendors. And as part of that, they're like, well, hey, we should certainly go with the TMS vendor of the same WMS because they should be integrated. Come to find out, they had integrated with the alternate vendor, but they'd never yet integrated their own WMS into their TMS. And so certainly an interesting story and conversation, because it's more common than you think. And that's where details matter and requirements matter.
Yeah, agreed 100%. I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the industry. There's some really cool stuff that we have gotten some briefings from some of the software providers and wanted to kind of talk. The key theme seems to be unified platform or tighter integration between WMS and TMS for those software vendors that have both, and extensibility. So Manhattan has, is pushing their unified platform. So basically, it's a common data model underneath the TMS and WMS. It's gaining some traction. We're seeing a lot of implementations. We know some clients that have it implemented, and they also have a microservices architecture, which is very extensible as well. Some of our clients are early stages in the implementation. They've either got the TMS done or the WMS done. They haven't been running both for a while, but it's going to be interesting to see. But if you think about it, it makes complete sense, right? If I update, something on an order in the TMS, it's basically the same field as I'm updating the WMS, or for, shipment. And we're seeing, OTM is trying to, at least their new EWM, their newer version of the warehouse management piece. They are doing more tight integration, not only with the ERP side of Oracle, but also with OTM. Brian, I don't know what you're seeing. I know there's a couple other vendors we can talk about, but wanted to get your perspective from the WMS side, because the theme seems to be, we're going to either put this on a common, data model, or we're going to have much tighter integration with extensibility, so that if you do have unique requirements, you can build your own without having to do, coming to the software vendor to do the modifications.
No, absolutely. And it's funny because you look back, if you've been in the industry for a long time, on the warehousing side, one of the advantages that High Jump, now is owned by Körber, is they had the whole platform. They had the WMS, they had labor, they had the yard management. They didn't quite have a full TMS yet, but they all touted the power of one. And that was a really, really big selling point.
Yep.
It was the same technology, the same development stack, all the tools that you had as a power of one. Now, over time, there's been acquisitions with Körber and other vendors. And, now Manhattan's a good example of where they're going back to the power of one concept, where it's all on one technology stack. But the technology is different because it's much more microservices based, a lot of details behind that. There's other vendors like Softion, for example, that are a little bit more monolithic, but from an integration standpoint, they are very microservices based. So it's a balance that you have on, and I'm not going to speak to the technology side in great detail of how a monolithic versus microservices versus what do master files look like, and all the details behind that. But just knowing that you have tight integration, that you have integration tools that give you the flexibility, and all of that is really what's the most important as you look at these types of applications.
Yeah, and so many of these software companies are growing by acquisition. I mean, you look at Blue Yonder and their One Network acquisition. When you're going through the buying process, it's also very important to understand what version are they pitching to you, right? Because there are some of these versions are better integrated than others. So as they go through their acquisition, like I said, Blue Yonder with their One Network. I mean, we've gotten a demo from them recently, and you can see that they're kind of flipping back and forth between the One Network and their common platform, but they're trying to pull those together. It takes time, just like as Manhattan, is building out their active TM. Their feature function is coming along. They continue to add things quarterly. The nice part is, as you go to these SaaS models, you can get these releases, and there's typically no downtime with a lot of the various vendors. I think the important thing here is just validate the integrations, right? Understand, what versions you're getting, right? What platform are they selling you? Because many of these, even if you go to like the E2 Open and some of the other ones they've grown through so many acquisitions, you got to understand, what product are you actually pitching? Is this the newer version? Is this the older version? What platform is this on within your own domain? And then I think understand your unique requirements. Make sure that you give the vendor sufficient time as you're going through an RFP process to handle your scripted demos. And your scripted demos should really be about a day in the life, with some common exceptions, and try and get them to use your data as they go through this process, because I think it's going to be important, and it's going to basically help you solidify that you're making the correct decision. That's data driven. It's not opinion. It's like, you've got my data. You've gone through a day in the life. We scored you. We've graded you. But do the work up front. This is where people select the wrong software. They go to the top right corner of Gartner's Magic Quadrant, and that's not to find a solution that can be used as a starting point or guidance. But please don't just go and think the guy in the top right is going to meet your unique business needs or meet all your business needs, because it's not going to happen.
Yeah, and you touched on a couple of things there, Tony, I think are really important. Number one is understand the requirements as it relates to the WMS that's being proposed. We've worked with a lot of the vendors, whether it's Manhattan or Texas or Infor, other vendors that have multiple WMS solutions. And all of them are right in the right application, but you need to fully understand what's being proposed, what that looks like, and how that integration fits. And so, that deep dive makes a big difference. I've seen, especially if you have very generic RFIs, I've actually caught vendors responding to say our WMS does that. And they actually said, well, this WMS does this piece and this WMS does this piece. Well, we all know that you're not going to get all of that in one system. Yeah. So those are the things that are really important. The details matter, as we've talked about earlier today.
Yep. Validate your vendor integrations independently. Don't use your analyst rankings as the gospel, right? Use them as a, starting point. Really understand what your strategy is. And that even includes, we don't want to get into AI, but, basically understanding what the software providers are doing in that space, what their product roadmap is, and how it's going to fit in with your overall organization's, goals and objectives.
Yeah, and just one other brief story, just to tie that all in is, and I'll use one of our customers' terms. They love to use the term secret sauce, and they're in the automotive world, so they don't even sell product that it would be a secret sauce. At least I hope not. But to that point, it's very important for them as they're looking at their technologies. And they're looking, and they use that term for ERPs, WMSs, and TMSs. There are very unique things, like we talked on the scripted demos. All of the vendors in the top right quadrant might miss all of your secret sauces, or vice versa. None of the ones that are on the low end might cover any of your secret sauce. So just make sure that you're very specific on what those needs are as well.
Yep. That's true, because as you mentioned, there are other vendors. We talked about some of the tier ones, but there are, you know, some tier two software vendors out there that may meet all your needs and be exactly what you need. So do your homework.
Do your homework and ask questions.
So, you know, as we recapped, just enlist some help to select softwares. Whether it's JBF or Cornerstone Edge or somebody else, get somebody to help you ensure that you've got your requirements defined, you've got your strategy, help you with the scripted demos if you feel like you can't do yourself. But spend the money up front, because it's going to save it tenfold on the back end if you go through the process of selecting the wrong product and have to do manual workarounds, modifications. We've seen it multiple times in TMS. We're living it with a client right now who selected software independently, and it's really not working for them well. So I'm sure you've seen the same in the WMS space, Brian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say feel free to ask us any questions along those lines. And then the only other caveat I would say is if you have bought a WMS and it's a struggle, it's a pain, or you bought a TMS and there's some challenges, there are many times it's not the software's fault. It could be a missing requirement. It could be something that is simple as a process change internally. So just know that if you already bought something and it's not working quite right, feel free to ask those questions as well.
Yeah. It's the people, process, policy side that sometimes gets missed, is what we call the go live gap. The software may be screwed in and may be live, but that doesn't mean it's working for you. But again, that's not always the software vendor's fault. There's a change component and adoption component as well. Mm-hmm. Appreciate your time today, Brian. Thank you all.